Hey there everyone, David here with your weekly Mouthful of David video. Like usual, we'll start with our weekly update about the podcast, although this time there isn't too much to report on. Our most recent episode is still the first part of our two-part series about Vladimir Lenin and the Russian Revolution. And the reason is because in the second part that we recently recorded, there's something messing with the audio quality of it, and so our editor, who works really hard and for free for us because we don't, make any money off of this project or anything, she's still trying to, figure out how to work through that because it is not easy to work through really bad background noise. But expect that out, relatively soon. After that will be our episode about heavyweight boxing champions. After that, we'll be doing another movie episode, so be on the lookout for that. And then we'll just kind of go from there. So anyway, this week's video is going to be about basically book recommendations for Latin American history. And it's pretty fitting because right now I'm wearing a jiu-jitsu shirt that says lock legs, not cages. And, it's basically about treating refugees humanely. And honestly, the United States has played a big role in helping create this current refugee crisis. So it's a very important thing to study, and it is part of kind of what got me interested in history, during my time in higher education. So before I get to the books themselves, just to kind of heads up, my master's degree is in 20th century Latin American revolutionary and counter-revolutionary history and U.S. history. So it's a double specialty. But in terms of Latin America, my specialty really is basically 20th century Cold War revolutions and the aftermath. So I don't really have too much to recommend by way of, colonial history or even some of the early modern stuff in the 1800s. That said, I do have two recommendations. One of them, The Broken Spears by Miguel León Portilla. And The Broken Spears is basically just an account of the Spanish overthrow of the Aztec Empire, told from the point of view of the Aztecs themselves, as opposed to the really, Eurocentric view that we get in, most places, right? Because generally speaking, if you do know anything about what happened to the Aztecs, it is from more of a sort of European perspective. And so there's just a good sort of counterweight to all that. The second book I have to recommend is The Pueblo Revolt of 1680 by Andrew Knott. And that is just about the most successful indigenous uprising that happened in colonial Spain during the era of colonization. And so those are, some good books to check out, but everything else that I'm going to recommend is basically about the 20th century or, thereafter, the more recent 21st century that we're currently in. So to start off, this book I basically recommend just anyone read because it's short, accessible, and provides a clear overview of things. And that is The Killing Zone by Stephen Rabe. And The Killing Zone is really good because it's only 198 pages, but in those 198 pages, it gives a really good overview of U.S. intervention in Latin America during the Cold War. And we're talking about not all of Latin America. It doesn't talk about every country, but it hits on every region. It talks about U.S. involvement in Central America, in the Caribbean, especially Cuba, and in South America. And, again, it traces it throughout the Cold War. So whatever other books you check out in this video, I would highly recommend checking out this one because it's a really good starting place. Another one that talks about Latin America as a whole and a little bit beyond is Empire's Workshop by Greg Grandin. And what that book talks about is basically how what the United States did in Latin America during the Cold War was actually the blueprint that they used there was the same blueprint that would later be sort of refurbished for the War on Terror in the Middle East. And it's a very cool and interesting book because it talks about how, foreign policy in a place that we unfortunately don't consider important, like Latin America, can kind of send these waves, right? Send these reverberations in how we're going to interact in other bigger, more, relevant places in the future. And it even affects what happens at home because the book also talks about how in using these blueprints first in Latin America, then in the War on Terror, it sort of reconfigured the American political landscape, and especially on the right. So it's just a really good book that checks all the boxes, and it is just a little bit over 200 pages. It's 250. Yeah, 250. So really good brief book that touches on a lot of really interesting and important things, even beyond Latin America, but still does talk about Latin America. And finally, this isn't like a grand overview, but Banananeras by Dana Frank is about women in labor unions in Central America, and specifically banana unions. And, actually, not Central America, Latin America as a whole. Sorry about that. So it's a really cool way to see not just history about labor unions in Latin America, but also, women's role therein, because, we don't talk enough about women in a lot of times in history. So with that said, there's not a whole lot of time left for the rest of this video, so I'll just talk about Mexican books, or books about Mexican history rather, and then next week I'll do a part 2. So the Mexican Revolution is my main specialty for Mexico. I read 7 books, which I'm not going to talk about all of them here because I don't want to punish you like that, because some of those were just giant tomes and felt like reading encyclopedias. The 2 I will recommend are The Mexican Revolution by Adolfo Goli and The Great Rebellion by Ramon Eduardo Ruiz. And so again, that is The Mexican Revolution by Adolfo Gili and The Great Rebellion by Ramon Eduardo Ruiz. And then there's also this one that I have here that I did not read for grad school, Villa and Zapata by Frank McLynn. And it's just a really fun kind of account of the Mexican Revolution, but focusing on the forces of Villa and Zapata. Finally, there is In the Shadow of the Mexican Revolution by Hector Aguilar Camín. And that one is kind of neat because the other books I've talked about really are about the Mexican Revolution itself, but this one, again, In the Shadow of the Mexican Revolution, is about the Mexican Revolution and its aftermath all the way until 1989, actually. So it gives you a really good, idea of what happened after the Mexican Revolution. Also, another thing that I've studied up on in Mexican history is the Zapatista Rebellion in 1994. And a good book that I have that is buried among all these other books, here we go, is Basta by George Collier. And Basta is a really nice sort of overview of the Zapatista Revolution. That being said, though, honestly, for the Zapatista Revolution, it's very easy to find good sources because it's such a popular rebellion that has captured the minds of people in recent decades, as well it should. It's a very fascinating subject. Because of that, there's just a ton of small, accessible books about the Zapatistas, and so, you buy like 3 or 4 of them for like $5 each online that are each like 100 pages, and you have a good sort of well-rounded perspective on the Zapatistas. So finally, I will recommend, just for recent political history, Mexico, Democracy Interrupted by Joe Tuckman. And that's just a good sort of recent history of Mexico. So those are all the recommendations I have for Mexican history. I'll also just very quickly mention two actually good books that give you an overview of Central American history. And so one of them is Central America and the United States by John Coatsworth. And then another one that I don't have with me, but I also read for grad school, was Power in the Isthmus by James Dunkerley. And so both of those are just really good overviews of, U.S. involvement in Central America as a whole. And they serve as a good blueprint, actually, for what I'll talk about next week when I get into some individual Central American countries, as well as Cuba and South America, too. So be on the lookout for that next week. Until then, thanks for listening, everyone. Have a good week. If you have any further questions for more book recommendations, especially about Mexico, let me know. If anyone's curious, I can tell you the other books I read for the Mexican Revolution. But otherwise, catch you next week. Stay safe and just have a good time. Good luck out there.